garage door slams shut, echoing through the oil-scented workshop. Miguel Alvarez, grease-stained hands, pulls his weathered nameplate from his locker. The new manager doesn't look up from his slim, glowing tablet. "We're restructuring, Miguel. Your skills are too specialized. We need generalists now." Miguel nods, offers no argument, and walks out into the cold afternoon. 3 days pass. Silence fills the empty marine bay. Suddenly the ground vibrates. 2 heavy matte black military pickups pull onto the gravel. Men in crisp Navy uniforms step inside, their eyes sharp and focused. "We're here for Mr. Alvarez," the officer says. The room falls into a deafening silence. Miguel Alvarez was 48 years old, a man whose life was measured in the rhythmic, industrial hum of heavy-duty diesel engines and the complex cooling cycles of high-pressure marine systems. His hands were a map of his career, calloused, scarred, and permanently stained with the faint scent of diesel fuel and sea salt. He was a single father, and his entire world revolved around his 14-year-old daughter, Elena. To Elena, her father wasn't just a mechanic. He was a magician who could fix anything with a rusted wrench and a bit of quiet patience. She had spent half her childhood on a stool in the corner of the garage, watching him breathe life back into dead machines. But to the new owners of the town's largest garage, the Apex Automotive Center, Miguel was an expensive relic of a bygone era. The garage had recently been bought by a holding company led by a man named Mr. Thompson. Thompson was a man of spreadsheets and efficiency metrics. He didn't see the history of the garage, which had been built on the backs of the local fishing fleet and the regional coastal patrol. He saw overhead. He saw a master mechanic who earned a premium salary because he was the only person in 3 counties who held a Level 4 certification for high-pressure recirculating cooling systems. Miguel was a specialist. He didn't spend his time oiling hinges or changing spark plugs on family sedans. He worked on the monsters, large-scale diesel engines, heavy-duty fishing trawlers, and specialized training vessels. He had 20 years of experience, a mountain of technical certifications from manufacturers that no longer existed, and a reputation for being the only man who could hear a hairline fracture in a piston before it shattered. However, the local garage was struggling to show the explosive growth Thompson's investors demanded. Thompson sat in his office, surrounded by whiteboards covered in graphs. He looked at the books and saw that the Marine Repair Division had fewer total customers than the light passenger car side. To an MBA like Thompson, the math was simple. More customers meant more profit. He decided that the garage should pivot entirely toward everyday commuters, oil changes, tire rotations, and brake pads. "Miguel," Thompson had said, sitting behind his clean mahogany desk that had never seen a drop of oil, "the market is changing. People aren't bringing in boat engines like they used to. We need to streamline our personnel. We're moving toward a high-volume, low-complexity model. We need generalists who can handle 20 cars a day, not a master of diesel who spends 3 days on one engine." Miguel had tried to warn him. He stood there, his work boots leaving faint, dusty prints on the expensive rug. "Sir, the marine market isn't about volume. It's about trust and specific, high-stakes technical requirements. Those monsters out there, they keep the lights on during the winter. If you cut the Marine Department, you lose the contracts that provide the real stability. You can't fix a Navy training vessel with a guy who only knows how to change the oil on a Prius." But Thompson didn't listen. He saw restructuring as a buzzword for success, a way to trim the fat and show his bosses he was decisive. He believed that technology and standardized manuals had made master mechanics like Miguel obsolete. He gave Miguel his final paycheck and a polite, sterile handshake. Miguel didn't argue. He didn't beg for his job or point out the 30 years of loyalty he had given to the previous owners. He had spent 2 decades building his dignity alongside his machines. He simply packed his tools, each one organized with surgical precision in a heavy, battered chest, and walked to his truck. Before he left, he stopped by the manager's office one last time. He didn't want to leave the shop in a lurch. "I've left the logs for the pending maintenance contracts in the second cabinet," Miguel said quietly. "Check the Navy files particularly. Some of those high-pressure systems are temperamental. They require a specific bleed sequence." Thompson had just nodded, already looking back at his next spreadsheet, distracted by a notification on his watch. "We'll be fine, Miguel. Our new diagnostic software handles the sequencing now. Good luck with your next chapter. I'm sure someone with your unique skill set will find something eventually." Miguel went home to Elena. He didn't tell her he was hurt or that his heart felt as heavy as a lead weight. He told her he was looking forward to having more time to help her with her science project, a model of a water filtration system. He spent the next 3 days in his backyard, fixing an old water pump for a neighbor, working with the slow, methodical grace of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, waiting for the world to realize what it had lost. The fourth day of the new Apex Automotive started with a sense of triumph for Mr. Thompson. He had replaced Miguel with 2 younger, cheaper general technicians who were fast with a computer but had never felt the heat of a heavy-duty diesel block. He felt efficient. He felt modern. But that feeling of efficiency was put to the ultimate test at 9:15 a.m. when the ground began to vibrate with the low-frequency rumble of heavy engines. It wasn't a customer in a sedan. It was a regional Navy technical team. They had arrived for a scheduled, high-priority maintenance appointment for a series of high-output diesel training engines. These weren't just engines. They were military assets used for coastal defense drills and engineer training. They were complex, incredibly sensitive, and required a very specific type of certification to even open the casing. 6 months prior, the garage had signed a lucrative, long-term contract with the Navy. The contract was massive. It provided a steady, guaranteed stream of revenue that far exceeded what the garage made from 6 months of oil changes and tire rotations combined. But Thompson, in his rush to streamline and cut costs, had read the contract like a brochure rather than a legal mandate. He had seen the dollar signs but ignored the technical writers. The Navy representative, a chief petty officer named Miller, walked into the office. He was a man who looked like he had been forged in a boiler room, sharp eyes, graying hair, and a presence that demanded immediate answers. He didn't want the free coffee. He didn't want to see the new customer lounge with the fancy espresso machine. He wanted to see the man who was listed in the federal database as the approved technical specialist for this facility. "Where is Mr. Alvarez?" Miller asked, his voice sounding like gravel being crushed. Thompson stood up, his professional smile suddenly feeling tight and brittle. "Ah, Mr. Alvarez. Well, he's no longer with the company. We've restructured to better serve our community. But don't worry, Chief. Our new team of technicians is highly trained and equipped with the latest diagnostic software. They are more than capable of handling your needs." Chief Miller stopped. He looked at Thompson with a cold, piercing gaze that seemed to see right through the corporate jargon. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a digital tablet, flicking to a specific page of a heavy, encrypted document. "Sir, you don't seem to understand the nature of this agreement," Miller said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level of calm. "This isn't a suggestion. This isn't a general service request. This contract was awarded to this specific facility for one reason, because you employed Miguel Alvarez. He is the only technician in this 3-state region with a Level 4 certification for high-pressure recirculating cooling systems required for these specific engines. These are military assets, Mr. Thompson. They are covered under federal safety mandates." Thompson's face turned a pale, sickly shade of gray. He had seen the Navy contract on the books, but he had assumed the facility was the one certified. He thought a certification was just a piece of paper that belonged to the shop, not the man. "Surely our other techs can—" "If a non-certified hand touches those engines," Miller interrupted, "the federal warranty is voided immediately. More importantly, your facility is in breach of contract. We will pull the equipment today, terminate the agreement, and I will be forced to file a report seeking damages for breach of terms. The certification follows the man, Mr. Thompson, not the building. If Alvarez isn't here, you don't have a contract. You have a very expensive piece of scrap metal sitting in your bay." The room went dead silent. The 2 new junior technicians, who had been laughing in the break room about the old guy just days before, were now staring at their boots through the glass partition. They had tried to run a diagnostic on one of the Navy units earlier that morning, but the software had locked them out, flashing a credential-required warning they didn't understand. Now they realized their jobs were tied to a man they had helped push out the door. Thompson grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling so much he almost dropped it. He searched for Miguel's number, his mind racing. He had to hope that Miguel hadn't already found a new job. He had to hope that Miguel's "call me if you need help" wasn't just a polite gesture to ease the awkwardness of being fired. We can get him on the phone," Thompson said, his voice thin and shaky. "Do more than that," Miller replied, crossing his arms. "Contact him now. We have a coastal training exercise starting in 48 hours. If these engines aren't certified and ready by tomorrow morning, the Navy will pull this contract, and I will personally ensure this facility is blacklisted from any future federal work. You have 1 hour to find him, or we start the removal process." Thompson didn't even wait to answer. He ducked into the hallway, the sound of his heavy breathing echoing in the quiet. He dialed Miguel's number, praying that the man he had called obsolete was still willing to listen. Miguel was in his backyard, his hands covered in a light layer of rust and grime from the old water pump he was restoring for his neighbor. He was enjoying the silence, the simple mechanics of the pump, a welcome relief from the complex, high-pressure world he had left behind. When his phone began to vibrate on the wooden table, he didn't even look at it at first. He let it ring. He wanted to enjoy the autonomy of his new life, but it rang again, and then a third time. He saw the name Thompson on the screen. Miguel didn't feel a rush of triumph. He didn't feel the need to gloat or laugh. He simply felt a deep, ingrained sense of duty. He knew that if Thompson was calling this many times, it was because something was wrong with the machines, and Miguel knew exactly which machines were sitting in that shop. He knew that the Navy contract was about more than just money. It was about the safety of the young sailors who relied on those engines in the middle of a storm. He answered on the fourth ring. "Alvarez speaking." Thompson's voice was frantic, a high-pitched mess of desperation. "Miguel, it's Thompson. Look, I made a mistake. A huge one. The Navy is here. Chief Miller. They're refusing to work with anyone else. They say the entire contract is tied to your specific Level 4 certification. I need you to come back. Now. Right now. I'll pay you double for the day. I'll cover your travel. Just get here." Miguel looked at Elena, who was watching him from the kitchen window, her eyes curious. He remembered the cold way he had been dismissed, like a piece of scrap metal that had lost its shine. He remembered Thompson looking at a tablet instead of a person. "I'm not interested in double pay for a day, Mr. Thompson," Miguel said, his voice calm and steady. "I told you that the Marine Department was the backbone of that shop. I told you that those systems were temperamental. If I come back, it's not to save your spreadsheet. It's to do the job right because those engines deserve better than a generalist guess. Whatever you want, Miguel, just please, talk to the chief." Miguel arrived at the garage 30 minutes later. He wasn't wearing a suit, and he didn't come in a fancy car. He arrived in his old truck, wearing his worn work coveralls. When he walked through the bay door, the atmosphere changed instantly. The tension that had been thick enough to cut with a knife seemed to dissipate. Chief Miller stepped forward, his stern face breaking into a crisp, professional nod of respect. "Dr. Alvarez," Miller said, using a title of respect common among the engineering corps. "Good to see you. We were told there was a restructuring that might have affected our schedule." "There was a misunderstanding of technical requirements, Chief," Miguel replied, looking at Thompson for a brief, cold second. "But the engines don't care about corporate structure. They care about physics. Let's get to work." The job wasn't flashy. There were no explosions or high-speed chases. It was a process of meticulous, quiet inspection. During the last maintenance cycle, before he was fired, Miguel had noticed a slight, almost imperceptible discoloration in the secondary coolant, a sign of calcium scaling starting deep within the recirculating pipes. He had recommended a full filter replacement in a chemical flush, but the order had been canceled by Thompson during the cost-cutting phase of the restructuring. Miguel worked alongside the Navy technicians. They didn't treat him like just a mechanic. They treated him like a specialist, an equal. They followed his lead as he pressure-tested the lines, their eyes following his every move as he used a manual gauge instead of the digital reader that was giving a false green signal. "The software says the flow is optimal," one of the junior Navy techs noted. "The software is reading the pump speed, Not the actual flow at the manifold, Miguel explained, his voice patient. If you have a blockage at the 90-degree bend, the pump works harder to maintain pressure, but the volume drops. Feel this pipe. He placed the tech's hand on the vibrating metal. Hear that high-pitched hum? That's cavitation. The impeller is fighting for fluid. He found exactly what he had feared, a pressure-regulating valve that was starting to stick due to the scaling he had identified weeks ago. In a high-speed training exercise under full load, that valve would have failed completely. The engine would have seized in seconds, leaving a boat stranded and helpless in open water. Miguel didn't make a scene about it. He didn't point it out to Thompson to make him feel small or incompetent. He simply showed the Navy team the worn, calcified seal. This is why we check the physical logs, not just the digital ones, Miguel said. The machine always tells you when it's hurting. You just have to know how to listen to the language it speaks. They replaced the valve, performed the chemical flush Miguel had originally requested, and ran a full diagnostic. The engine purred with a perfect deep resonance that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of a machine that was healthy. Chief Miller checked the final levels, verified the signatures, and closed the logbook. Certified, Miller said, looking at the junior techs and then at Thompson. Good work, Miguel. We'll see you in 6 months for the next phase. And remember, Mr. Thompson, the Navy expects this level of quality every time. If Mr. Alvarez isn't signing the book, we don't bring the equipment. No exceptions, no excuses. As the Navy trucks pulled away, the garage became quiet again. But the silence was different now. It was the heavy, pregnant silence of a man realizing he had almost thrown away his most valuable asset for a handful of pennies. Thompson stood by the engine, looking at the man who had just saved his business from a federal lawsuit. Miguel was already cleaning his tools, putting each one back into its specific padded slot in his chest. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't celebrating. He was just a man who knew his craft. He turned to Thompson and said, "The Navy didn't come here for the Apex automotive sign, sir. They came here for the expertise. You can restructure a building, you can repaint the walls, and you can buy new tablets, but you can't restructure 20 years of experience into a generalist." The next morning, the garage didn't open for business at the usual 8 a.m. Instead, Thompson called an emergency meeting of the entire staff in the main bay. He didn't stand behind his clean mahogany desk this time. He didn't have his tablet in his hand. He stood on the concrete floor, right where the Navy engines had been, surrounded by the smell of diesel and the tools of the trade. "I've spent a lot of time looking at spreadsheets lately," Thompson began, his voice humbler, stripped of the corporate bravado he had arrived with. "I thought I could simplify this business into a numbers game. I thought that by cutting what I saw as specialized overhead, I could make the whole thing more efficient and more profitable. But yesterday taught me a lesson that isn't taught in business school." He looked at Miguel, who was standing at the very back of the room, leaning against a pillar. "The Navy didn't come back yesterday because we have the newest diagnostic software or a fancy lounge. They came back because we have a man who knows how to listen to a machine. I realize now that the marine market isn't just a small niche we can ignore. It's the heart of this town, and it's the foundation of this garage's reputation. The fishing boats, the training vessels, the coastal patrol, they all come here because they trust a specific set of hands. They trust Miguel." Thompson stepped forward, offering a new document to Miguel. It wasn't just a return to his old job. It was a contract for a new position, lead technical director of marine operations. He would have the authority to manage the specialized contracts, the budget for marine parts, and, most importantly, the authority to train a new generation of specialists. Miguel didn't accept immediately. He didn't care about the title. He cared about the terms of the work. "I'll come back," Miguel said, his voice carrying clearly through the bay. "But not to a streamlined model that ignores the complexity of the machines. We need a dedicated marine team that isn't pulled away to do oil changes on sedans. We need to invest in the certifications for the younger guys so they aren't just reading screens, but actually learning the physics. And most importantly, my hours are fixed. I have a daughter who is my priority. If the spreadsheets can't handle a man being home for dinner at 6 p.m., then you don't need a lead director." Thompson didn't hesitate. "Agreed. Your terms are more than fair. They're necessary. We're going to rebuild the Marine Division from the ground up, and we're going to do it your way. The Apex way is now the Alvarez way. The other mechanics, the ones who had been terrified for their own jobs during the restructuring, felt a massive wave of relief. They realized that Miguel's return wasn't just about his ego. It was about the stability of the entire shop. They saw that deep expertise wasn't a threat to their positions. It was the shield that protected the business from its own mistakes. They saw a man stand up for the value of the craft, and they respected him for it. Miguel returned to work the following Monday. He didn't change his style. He didn't get a fancy office. He still wore the same dark blue coveralls. He still got grease under his fingernails and oil on his boots. But the way people looked at him was fundamentally different. He wasn't the old guy or an expensive relic anymore. He was the man who had the Navy on speed dial. He was the master of the craft. And as he began to teach the younger mechanics how to feel the vibration of a diesel block and listen for the language of the valves, he knew that he had built something that no spreadsheet could ever quantify. The town's fishing fleet began to return. Word spread that Miguel was back in charge of the Marine Bay, and the schedule filled up within 48 hours. The garage was busier than it had ever been, not because of high-volume oil changes, but because people knew that if Miguel Alvarez signed the book, the engine would run. A month passed, and the Apex garage was transformed. The streamlined model had been replaced by a culture of deep technical pride. The Marine Division was booming, and Thompson had even started taking classes on basic diesel mechanics just so he could understand what his lead director was talking about in the weekly meetings. Miguel sat in his new, modest office, a space carved out of the back of the bay so he could stay close to the work. He had implemented a rigorous tracking system for every technical certification and every maintenance log. There would be no more forgotten clauses and no more cost-cutting on essential safety components. He was building a legacy, one engine at a time. That evening, he arrived home exactly at 6 p.m. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the backyard. Elena was in the kitchen finishing up her science project. She had built a fully functional recirculating filter system. "Hey, Dad," she said, looking up with a bright smile. "Check it out. I added a pressure relief valve just like the one you showed me on the truck. It keeps the flow steady even when I clog the intake." Miguel laughed and pulled a chair up next to her, looking at her small, determined hands as she adjusted a tiny valve on her model. "Did the Navy save your job, Dad?" "That's what the kids at school were saying. They said a whole fleet of ships came to get you." Miguel smiled, looking at the simple, perfect mechanics of her project. "No, Elena, the Navy didn't save my job. They were just the ones who reminded everyone else why I was there in the first place. The contract saved the job, but the competence is what built the contract." He helped her tighten a seal on her project, his grease-stained hand steady next to hers. "You see this? If you do the work right, the work will protect you. People can try to restructure the world all they want. They can try to simplify it into numbers and spreadsheets, but they can't restructure a person who knows exactly what they're doing and takes pride in it." Elena nodded, her eyes shining. "So, you're not a hero?" "I'm just a mechanic, sweetheart," Miguel replied, his eyes reflecting the soft light of the kitchen. "I just happened to be the only one who knew where the leak was before the ship started to sink." The world often thinks that luck or big organizations are the things that change lives. People think a visit from the Navy is a miracle or a stroke of fate. But for Miguel Alvarez, the miracle was the 20 years of quiet, disciplined, and often thankless work that had made him indispensable. He wasn't lucky. He was ready. As he sat there with his daughter, helping her build her own future with her own two hands, he knew that the best spotlight in the world isn't the one that shines on you from the outside. It's the one you build yourself, bolt by bolt, through the quality of your character and the mastery of your craft. He had found his place again, not by changing who he was, but by proving that who he was exactly what the world needed. If you believe that deep experience is irreplaceable by quick decisions, subscribe for more stories of hidden masters. Leave a comment. Have you ever seen expertise being underestimated? Tell us your story below.